Most people think the CIA was created in 1947. The National Security Act, signed by Harry Truman on July 26, 1947, established the Central Intelligence Agency as a peacetime civilian intelligence organization. Clean origin, specific date, legislative act, democratic process producing a new institution. But here is the problem with that version. The men who ran the CIA in its first decade, who designed its covert operations capability, who built its networks across Europe and Asia, who established its relationships with foreign intelligence services, and who conducted the operations that defined what the CIA actually was, rather than what its founding legislation said it should be, were not new to the work in 1947. They had been doing it under different organizational names and with different legal authorities since 1942. The CIA was not created in 1947. It was legalized in 1947. The institution that the National Security Act created on paper had been operating in substance for 5 years before Truman signed the legislation. And the men who built it, the networks they used, the methods they employed, and the relationships they cultivated during those 5 years shaped what the CIA became in ways that its founding legislation did not authorize, and that Congress did not know about. To understand what the CIA actually is, you have to start not with the National Security Act but with the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which Franklin Roosevelt created by executive order in June 1942, and with the specific group of men who ran its covert operations and who became, after the OSS was formally dissolved in September 1945, the institutional core of what eventually became the CIA. William Donovan built the OSS. Donovan was a Wall Street lawyer, a World War I hero, a Republican who was nonetheless trusted by Roosevelt, and a man who'd been arguing for years before Pearl Harbor that the United States needed a centralized intelligence and covert operations capability comparable to what Britain's MI6 and Special Operations Executive provided. Roosevelt gave him the authority to build it in 1942, and Donovan built it with the resources and the methods he had available, which meant recruiting heavily from the same social networks that had produced him, the Ivy League universities, the Wall Street law firms, and the established Protestant elite that had dominated American institutional life for generations. The OSS at its peak employed 13,000 people. Its research and analysis branch produced intelligence assessments. Its secret intelligence branch ran agents in occupied Europe and Asia. Its special operations branch conducted sabotage and worked with resistance movements. Its X2 branch handled counterintelligence, and its operational culture, shaped by Donovan's personality and his recruitment choices, was characterized by a combination of genuine patriotism, institutional improvisation, and a casual relationship with the legal boundaries of American government that would persist in the organization's successor institutions for decades. Donovan's personal papers are at the U.S. Army Military History Institute at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The OSS records, which were classified for decades, have been progressively declassified and are now largely available through the National Archives. What they show, in aggregate, is an organization that operated with enormous latitude and minimal oversight, that made decisions about who to work with and what methods to use based on operational necessity rather than legal constraint, and that established relationships with individuals and organizations that a peacetime civilian intelligence agency would not have been authorized to cultivate. Those relationships were the foundation on which the CIA was built. Harry Truman did not want a CIA. This fact, documented in his own diaries and in his subsequent public statements about the agency, is one of the more striking ironies in American intelligence history. Truman had dissolved the OSS in September 1945, 2 months after Japan's surrender, precisely because he was concerned about the emergence of a peacetime American secret police. His executive order dissolving the OSS stated that there was no place in a peaceful democratic system for a Gestapo-like organization. Those are Truman's words in a presidential executive order about the kind of organization the OSS represented, and that he specifically did not want to continue. What he got was the CIA. The path from Truman's dissolution of the OSS in September 1945 to his signing of the National Security Act in July 1947 is documented in the records of the National Security Council, the State Department, and the military services, all of which were conducting their own intelligence activities in the vacuum left by the OSS's dissolution, and all of which had institutional interests in the design of whatever intelligence organization emerged to replace it. The Central Intelligence Group, established by Truman in January 1946 as a temporary coordinating body before permanent legislation could be passed, was the transitional institution. Its first director was Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, a Missouri businessman with no intelligence background who held the position for 6 months before being replaced by General Hoyt Vandenberg, who held it for another year before the CIA was formally established. The men who actually designed the CIA's operational capabilities were not the directors. They were the operators, the men who had run OSS covert operations, and who were now, in the transitional period between 1945 and 1947, arguing within the government for a particular kind of peacetime intelligence organization. Frank Wisner is the most important of those men, and the least known to general audiences. Wisner had run OSS operations in Romania and in southeastern Europe during the war. He had seen the Soviet Union's consolidation of control over Eastern Europe at close range, and had returned to Washington in 1945 convinced that the United States needed a covert capability to counter Soviet expansion that went far beyond the collection of intelligence. He wanted an organization that could conduct political operations, support anti-communist movements, influence foreign elections, and conduct what he called peacetime operations in the grey area between diplomacy and military force. Wisner returned to Wall Street briefly after the war, then came back to government in 1947 as head of the State Department's Office of Policy Coordination, which despite its anodyne name was the covert operations arm of the emerging intelligence community. When the CIA was formally established in 1947, the Office of Policy Coordination was brought under its organizational umbrella, and Wisner became, in effect, the CIA's covert operations chief, a position he formalized as Deputy Director for Plans when that position was created in 1951. What Wisner built under the organizational cover first of the State Department and then of the CIA was a covert operations capability that operated largely outside the legal framework the National Security Act had established. The 1947 legislation authorized the CIA to coordinate intelligence activities and to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may, from time to time, direct. That phrase, such other functions and duties, became the legal hook on which Wisner's covert operations were hung. The NSC Directive NSC 10-2, issued in June 1948, authorized the CIA to conduct propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrillas, and refugee liberation groups. NSC 10-2 was a classified document. Congress did not vote on it. The authorization for covert operations that defined what the CIA would actually do for the next several decades was not in the legislation Congress passed. It was in a classified National Security Council directive that Congress had not seen and did not know about. This is the gap between what the National Security Act created and what the CIA became. The legislation created a civilian intelligence coordinating body with ambiguous additional authorities. The classified directives created a covert operations organization with authorities that went far beyond what the legislation's language could reasonably be read to support. The men who designed NSC 10-2 were not acting in bad faith. They were responding to a genuine strategic challenge: the Soviet Union's consolidation of control over Eastern Europe, and the communist movements that were gaining strength in France, Italy, and Greece, with the tools they had available and the sense of urgency that the emerging Cold War produced. But they were also constructing a covert operations apparatus that operated outside meaningful oversight, that answered to a small number of senior officials rather than to the legislative process, and that established precedents for secret government action that would persist and expand for decades. Allen Dulles is the other central figure in the CIA's actual origin, and his trajectory from OSS to CIA illustrates how the institutional continuity worked in practice. Dulles had run OSS operations in Switzerland during the war, managing a network of agents and sources across occupied Europe from a base in Bern. He was, by any measure, one of the most effective intelligence operators the United States produced during the war, and his Swiss operation produced intelligence on German military and political developments that proved genuinely valuable. After the war, Dulles returned to the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm in New York, where he and his brother John Foster Dulles had been partners before the war. Sullivan and Cromwell represented American business interests across Europe, giving Alan Dulles access to the corporate and financial networks that proved useful in intelligence work. He maintained his connections to the intelligence community throughout his time in private practice, advising the CIG and later the CIA on European matters. Dulles became CIA Deputy Director in 1951 and Director in 1953, a position he held until Kennedy fired him after the Bay of Pigs in 1961. His 8 years as director were the period in which the CIA conducted the operations that defined its public reputation and its internal culture. The overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, the failed Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba in 1961, and the extensive covert operations in Europe that range from funding democratic political parties to conducting psychological warfare operations that Congress had not authorized. The organizational continuity between the OSS and the CIA is documented in the personnel records of both organizations, which show a substantial overlap between the men who ran OSS operations and the men who built the CIA's covert capabilities. Wisner, Dulles, Richard Helms, Desmond Fitzgerald, James Angleton, Tracy Barnes, and dozens of others made the transition from OSS to CIA, carrying with them the operational methods, the institutional culture, and the personal networks they had developed during the war. Angleton deserves particular attention because his role illuminates the network dimension of the CIA's origin most clearly. James Jesus, Angleton had run OSS counterintelligence in Italy during the war. His counterintelligence operation in Rome included a relationship with Italian intelligence services, with Vatican intelligence networks, and with elements of the Italian political establishment that the OSS had cultivated as assets during and immediately after the war. When the CIA was established, Angleton became its chief of counterintelligence, a position he held from 1954 until his forced retirement in 1974. His 20 years in that role gave him control over the CIA's most sensitive information, its knowledge of Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence services, and its management of the double-agent operations that were the most valuable and most secret component of the Cold War intelligence competition. Angleton's counterintelligence empire within the CIA was built on the networks and the methods he had developed in Italy during the war. The Italian connection, his relationships with Italian intelligence, with elements of the Vatican, and with Italian political figures who had been cultivated as OSS assets, persisted throughout his CIA career and gave him access to information and to operational capabilities that operated outside the CIA's formal organizational structure. The relationship between Angleton's CIA counterintelligence apparatus and the Italian political operations that the CIA was conducting in the late 1940s and 1950s, specifically the funding and support of the Christian Democratic Party against the Italian Communist Party in the crucial Italian elections of 1948, illustrates how the OSS networks became the operational foundation of the CIA's covert influence work. The Italian election operation of 1948 is documented in the CIA's own historical records, portions of which have been declassified, and in the accounts of participants including William Colby, who was a junior CIA officer in Italy in the early 1950s, and who described the Italian operations in his memoir. The operation involved funding the Christian Democrats, supporting civic organizations, conducting propaganda, and working with elements of the Catholic Church and the Vatican to deliver the electoral outcome that Washington wanted. The operation worked. The Christian Democrats won decisively. The Italian Communist Party, which had been the strongest communist party in Western Europe, and which had genuine prospects of winning the election, was defeated. The success of the Italian operation established a template for CIA covert influence operations that was applied across Western Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and eventually globally. The template had been developed in the OSS context, adapted for the post-war environment by Wisner and Angleton, and then operationalized through the CA structure that the 1947 legislation provided. The stay-behind networks that the CIA established across Western Europe in the late 1940s and 1950s are another dimension of the OSS to CIA continuity that the conventional account minimizes. The stay-behind concept was simple and alarming. In each Western European country, the CIA and the relevant National Intelligence Service established a clandestine network of personnel, weapons caches, and communications infrastructure that would be activated in the event of a Soviet invasion. The networks would conduct resistance operations behind Soviet lines, coordinate with NATO military forces, and maintain contact with the exile governments that would presumably operate from London or Washington. The concept was operationally sensible given the strategic situation of the late 1940s, when a Soviet conventional military advance into Western Europe was considered a genuine possibility. The implementation was considerably more problematic. The stay-behind networks in Italy, which came to be called Gladio, were established using personnel who had been recruited during the war from the Italian right wing, including individuals with connections to the Italian fascist movement that had been defeated in 1945. The use of former fascists in anti-communist networks was not unique to Italy. It was a pattern that repeated across the stay-behind operations in multiple countries, because the individuals with the most intense anti-communist motivation and the most useful operational skills in the immediate post-war period were frequently men whose previous political commitments had put them on the wrong side of the recent war. Gladio remained secret until 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti disclosed its existence to the Italian Parliament. The disclosure produced an investigation that revealed not only the network's existence, but its involvement in a series of political violence incidents in Italy in the 1970s, the period of Italian political history known as the Years of Lead, in which terrorist violence from both left-wing and right-wing organisations produced hundreds of deaths and a sustained political crisis. The connection between the CIA-supported stay-behind networks and the political violence of the Years of Lead is documented in the Italian parliamentary investigation and in subsequent historical research. The connection is not uniformly accepted by historians, and the specific responsibility of CIA-connected elements for specific incidents remains disputed. What is not disputed is that the networks existed, that they included individuals with extreme right-wing orientations, and that elements of those networks were involved in political violence in ways that the CIA's founding legislation had not authorized and that Congress had not sanctioned. The Gladio story is the most dramatic illustration of what happens when covert operations networks, established outside meaningful oversight, develop their own operational logic. But it is not unique. The pattern of CIA-supported networks operating outside their original mandate, engaging in activities that the founding legislation could not have contemplated, is documented across multiple operations in multiple countries in the CIA's first 2 decades. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's program of cultivating relationships with American journalists and media organizations to influence domestic and foreign public opinion, is documented in the Church Committee's 1975 investigation. The program recruited journalists at major American news organizations, funded publications and cultural organizations, and used the media relationships to place stories favorable to CIA positions and unfavorable to its adversaries. The Church Committee found that the CIA had relationships with over 400 American journalists and with major news organizations including the New York Times, Washington Post, and CBS News. The relationships range from passive journalists who occasionally reported information to CIA contacts to active journalists who were essentially CIA employees who used their media credentials as cover for intelligence work. The Mockingbird program operated under the organizational cover of the CIA's International Organizations Division, run by Cord Meyer, another OSS veteran. Its legal basis, like so much of the CIA's covert operations work, was the catch-all language of the National Security Act and the classified NSC directives that the 1947 legislation had authorized without specifying. The conventional account of the CIA's founding presents the 1947 legislation as the institution's origin and measures its subsequent conduct against the legislation's stated purposes. The revisionist account, supported by the documentary record of the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, and the subsequent declassifications of the 1990s and 2000s, presents the 1947 legislation as a legal cover for an institution whose actual character had been determined years earlier by the men who built it from the OSS's networks and methods. Both accounts are supported by portions of the primary source record. The National Security Act is a real piece of legislation that created a real organizational framework. The OSS veterans who populated that framework brought with them real operational capabilities and real institutional cultures that shaped what the organization actually did. The gap between the two accounts is the gap between what the legislation authorized and what the institution did. That gap, documented in the Church Committee records, in the declassified operational histories, in the memoirs of participants, and in the ongoing releases of CIA historical records is where the CIA's real origin lives, not in the National Security Act of 1947, in the OSS operations of 1942 to 1945, in the networks that those operations built, in the men who ran them, and in the classified directives that authorized what those men wanted to do in the years after the legislation was signed. The documents are in the National Archives, in the Church Committee records held at the National Archives, in the CIA's own CREST database of declassified records, and in the archives of the men who built the institution. They do not tell the story of an institution created by an act of Congress in July 1947. They tell the story of an institution that was legalized by an act of Congress in July 1947, after having been built, staffed, and operationally oriented by a specific group of men whose methods and purposes the legislation neither fully described nor fully authorized. That is the true origin of the CIA, not 1947, 1942. And the men who carried it from one date to the other are in the documents. Their names are there, their networks are there, their methods are there. The conventional account stops at the legislation. The documentary record begins 5 years earlier. That gap is the story. Subscribe if you want to follow more. I'll see you in the next one. The paperclip connection is the dimension of the CIA's origin that the conventional account most consistently avoids, and it connects the OSS to CIA transition to a set of decisions made in 1945 and 1946 whose consequences ran through American intelligence for decades. Operation Paperclip was the program through which the United States recruited German scientists, engineers, and intelligence operatives after World War II. Its scientific dimension, the recruitment of rocket scientists including Wernher von Braun, is relatively well documented in the mainstream historical literature. Its intelligence dimension is less well known and considerably more disturbing. The intelligence component of Paperclip brought into American service a number of former German intelligence officers whose operational experience and agent networks were considered valuable in the emerging Cold War context. The most significant of these was Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen had been the chief of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front during the war, running the Foreign Army's East Department of the Wehrmacht. His organization had developed extensive networks of agents in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet-occupied territories, and when Germany's defeat became apparent, Gehlen preserved those networks by microfilming the records and surrendering them, along with himself and his key officers, to American military intelligence rather than to the Soviets. The deal Gehlen offered the Americans was straightforward. He and his organization would be taken to the United States, debriefed, and then sent back to West Germany to rebuild their intelligence networks, now directed against the Soviet Union on behalf of American intelligence rather than against the Soviet Union on behalf of Nazi Germany. In exchange, Gehlen's organization would be protected, funded, and allowed to maintain its own operational integrity, rather than being absorbed into American intelligence structures. The Americans, specifically Donovan's successor at OSS and then the CIG, accepted the deal. The Gehlen organization, as it came to be known, operated under CIA direction from 1946 until 1956, when it was transferred to the West German government as the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, which remains the Federal Republic's Foreign Intelligence Service today. During its decade of CIA operation, the Gehlen organization provided intelligence on Soviet military capabilities and on Eastern European political developments that the CIA could not have generated through its own networks. What the Gehlen organization also provided was a set of personnel, methods, and relationships that had their origins in Nazi Germany's intelligence apparatus. Many of Gehlen's officers had been members of the SS or other Nazi organizations. Some had been involved in operations on the Eastern Front that included war crimes. The CIA's acceptance of the Gehlen deal involved at minimum a willingness to overlook these backgrounds in exchange for the operational capabilities the organization offered. The Gehlen files, portions of which were declassified following a congressional mandate in the 1990s, document the nature of the relationship and the backgrounds of the individuals involved. The National Security Archive at George Washington University has published analyses of these files. What they show is consistent with what critics of Paperclip had alleged for decades. The CIA incorporated into its operational structure individuals whose wartime records were incompatible with the democratic values the CIA was nominally serving. The incorporation of the Gehlen organization into CIA operations also illustrates a broader pattern in the CIA's early years. the use of assets whose operational value was considered to outweigh the moral and political costs of the association. This pattern, which began with the Gale and Deal and continued in the relationships with former fascists in the Italian stay-behind networks, established an operational culture in which the question of what an asset had done before becoming an American asset was treated as secondary to the question of what the asset could provide. That operational culture, established in the OSS years and carried into the CIA by the men who made the transition, produced the pattern of associations with unsavory actors that has characterized CIA operations throughout its history. The relationships with right-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America, with drug-connected warlords in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam era, with Mujahideen factions in Afghanistan that included individuals who later became adversaries, all reflect the same operational logic that the Gale Deal established at the beginning. The logic is not indefensible on its own terms. Intelligence operations require working with people who would not pass a character test, because the people who control the information that intelligence operations need are frequently the people who are in the most compromised positions. The question is whether the operational value of the relationships justifies the moral and political costs, and whether the oversight structures exist to make that judgment rationally, rather than simply defaulting to whatever the operators on the ground consider necessary. The CIA of the early decades operated with oversight structures that were not adequate to make that judgment rationally. The congressional oversight committees that were supposed to monitor the CIA were, in the early years, largely deferential to executive branch assertions of national security necessity, and were not provided with complete information about what the agency was doing. The intelligence committees that would provide more rigorous oversight were not established until after the Church Committee investigations of 1975 and 1976, which revealed the extent of what had been happening without oversight. The Church Committee is the document that most fully bridges the gap between the CIA's official founding history and its actual operational history. The committee's final report, published in 1976, documented the assassination plots against foreign leaders, the domestic surveillance programs including COINTELPRO and Chaos, the mail opening programs, the media influence operations, and the covert operations in Chile, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere that had been conducted outside meaningful congressional knowledge or authorization. The committee's report is a public document. It is in the congressional record. It is available through the government printing office. It contains, in the detail of its findings, a portrait of an institution that had been doing things its founding legislation did not authorize, without the oversight its democratic context required, since the years when it was being built by the OSS veterans who carried their wartime methods and relationships into peacetime service. Senator Frank Church, who chaired the committee, described the CIA in his opening statement as a rogue elephant on a rampage. He later walked back this characterization, acknowledging that the CIA had been operating within a framework of executive authorization, even when it was operating outside congressional knowledge. The revised characterization was more accurate. The CIA was not rogue. It was authorized by classified directives, by executive orders, by NSC decisions that Congress had not seen, to do what it was doing. The authorization came from the executive branch. The oversight came from nobody. That is the structure that the men who built the CIA from the OSS designed, whether deliberately or by default, in the years between 1945 and 1947. The post-Church Committee reforms, specifically the establishment of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence as oversight bodies with genuine access to classified information, represented the most significant structural change in the CIA's governance since its founding. Whether those reforms have been adequate to the oversight task is a question that subsequent decades of CIA conduct have not definitively answered. The reforms gave Congress more information. They did not change the fundamental structure in which the CIA operates under executive authorization, conducts operations whose details are classified, and is accountable to oversight bodies whose members are bound by classification rules that prevent them from sharing what they learn with the public they represent. That structure, the combination of executive authorization and congressional oversight operating in a classified environment, is the structure that the CIA has operated under since the post-Church reforms. It is more constrained than the pre-Church structure, in which congressional oversight was largely nominal. Whether it is adequate to the democratic accountability that an intelligence agency operating in a constitutional system should be subject to is a question on which reasonable people disagree. The men who built the CIA from the OSS did not design an institution with democratic accountability in mind. They designed an institution with operational effectiveness in mind, in a context where the threat they were responding to, Soviet espionage and Soviet-supported political movements in Western Europe, was genuine and immediate, and where the tools of democratic accountability, public debate, legislative authorization, transparent budgets were seen as constraints that the adversary did not operate under, and that American intelligence therefore could not afford. That logic is understandable in its historical context. It is also the logic that produced the Church Committee findings, the Gladio revelations, the Iran-Contra affair, and every other episode in which the CIA's operational culture collided with the democratic norms its founding country claims to represent. The true origin of the CIA is the Office of Strategic Services, the classified NSC directives, the Galen deal, the stay-behind networks, and the operational culture that Frank Wisner, Alan Dulles, James Angleton, and the other OSS veterans built from 1942 onward and legalized in 1947. It is not the National Security Act. The National Security Act gave the institution a name and a legal home. The OSS gave it its methods, its networks, its culture, and its sense of what it was for. The documents say so. The OSS records are in the National Archives. The Church Committee report is in the Congressional Record. The Galen files are at the National Security Archive. The CIA's own declassified histories are in the CREST database. The true origin is documented, not in 1947, in 1942. And everything that followed from 1947 onward was shaped by what was built in those 5 years before the legislation made it official. That is where the CIA actually came from. The documents know it. The conventional account does not say it. The gap between those two is where this story lives. Subscribe if you want more. I'll see you in the next one. The Iran operation of 1953 is where the CIA's operational capabilities, built from the OSS networks and the classified NSC authorities, first became publicly visible in a way that allowed a retrospective assessment of what had been constructed in the years since 1947. The overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in August 1953, known within the CIA as Operation Ajax and within British intelligence as Operation Boot, was the CIA's first successful covert regime change operation, and the template for the Guatemala operation that followed in 1954. Its conduct, its authorization, and its consequences illuminate the CIA of the early 1950s more clearly than any other single operation. Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British oil concession that had been extracting Iranian petroleum since 1913 and paying royalties that the Iranian government considered inadequate. The nationalization was popular in Iran, where resentment of British oil interests was widespread, and where Mossadegh was a genuinely popular figure whose democratic legitimacy was substantial. The British government, which held a majority stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, appealed to the Truman administration for American assistance in reversing the nationalization. Truman declined, in part because he was skeptical of helping Britain reassert colonial-era economic privileges in the Middle East, and in part because his intelligence advisors did not assess Mossadegh as a communist threat. The Eisenhower administration, which took office in January 1953 with John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and Alan Dulles as CIA Director, took a different view. The Dulles brothers had represented Anglo-Iranian Oil Company interests through the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm before the war. Their assessment of the Mossadegh situation reflected both a genuine concern about Soviet influence in Iran and institutional relationships with the oil interests that had been among Sullivan and Cromwell's most significant clients. The CIA's official history of Operation Ajax, written internally in 1954 and classified for decades, was partially declassified and released in 2013 after a Freedom of Information lawsuit. It is one of the most candid documents in the CIA's public record, written by an agency historian who had access to the operation's internal records and who described its conduct without the sanitizing that official public histories typically apply. The document acknowledges that the operation was conducted through bribery of Iranian politicians, funding of street mobs that created the impression of popular opposition to Mossadegh, and coordination with elements of the Iranian military that staged a coup when the conditions had been prepared. It acknowledges that the operation violated the sovereignty of a democratic government. It also presents the operation within its own analytical framework as a success. The framework within which it was a success was the Cold War framework in which preventing Soviet influence in Iran was the primary objective, and the democratic legitimacy of the government being overthrown was a secondary consideration. Within that framework, the operation worked. Mossadegh was removed, the Shah was restored to power, Iranian oil interests were reorganized in a way that gave American companies a share of what had previously been a British monopoly. The long-term consequences within the same framework were more complicated. The Shah's restoration produced a regime that became increasingly repressive through the 1960s and 1970s, generating the popular resentment that fueled the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The CIA's own assessments in the years before 1979, portions of which have been declassified, show an agency that consistently underestimated the revolutionary potential, and that was as surprised by the Shah's fall as any outside observer. The connection between the 1953 operation and the 1979 revolution, between the CIA's removal of Mossadegh and the subsequent emergence of the Islamic Republic that has been a primary American adversary for 4 decades, is a documented consequence of the covert operations capability that the OSS veterans built and that the National Security Act legalized. Whether the operation was worth its consequences is a question that the intelligence professionals who designed and conducted it would have answered differently in 1953 than in 1979, and differently in 1979 than observers today might. The framework within which operations are evaluated changes as the consequences become visible. The CIA of 1953 was optimizing for the Cold War framework of 1953. The consequences it produced were experienced in a different framework decades later. The Guatemala operation of 1954, Operation PB Success, followed the same template as Ajax with modifications for the Central American context. Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected Guatemalan president, had initiated a land reform program that affected the United Fruit Company, the American agricultural conglomerate that dominated Guatemala's economy and that had significant political connections in Washington. The Dulles brothers again. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, had been on United Fruit's board of directors. Alan Dulles had represented United Fruit through Sullivan and Cromwell. The CIA's assessment of Arbenz as a communist threat, which was the justification for the overthrow operation, reflected both genuine Cold War concerns and institutional relationships that created a conflict of interest that was not acknowledged at the time. PB Success used CIA-organized mercenary forces, a psychological warfare campaign that included fabricated radio broadcasts and the bribery of Guatemalan military officers to produce Arbenz's resignation. It worked, in the same operational sense that Ajax had worked. Arbenz was removed. A military government friendly to American business interests was installed. The long-term consequences in Guatemala were also devastating. The military governments that succeeded Arbenz governed through repression that intensified into full-scale political violence in subsequent decades. The Guatemalan Civil War, which ran from 1960 to 1996, killed an estimated 200,000 people, with the vast majority of deaths attributed to state security forces supported by the United States. The CIA's role in the Guatemala Civil War extended well beyond the 1954 operation. The training and support of Guatemalan security forces that conducted the violence was documented in the State Department's own report, issued in 1999, which acknowledged American responsibility for training forces that committed human rights abuses. The report is a public document. The pattern from Iran to Guatemala to Vietnam to Chile to Central America in the 1980s reflects the operational logic that the CIA's founders embedded in the institution. Covert operations to prevent unfavorable political outcomes, conducted outside public knowledge and legislative authorization, producing consequences that the operations designers had not fully anticipated, which were then managed through additional covert operations, which produced additional unanticipated consequences. This is not a criticism that requires any particular political orientation. It is a description of what the operational record shows, documented in the CIA's own histories, in the congressional investigations, in the foreign government archives that have been partially opened, and in the academic historical research that has drawn on all of these sources. The true origin of the CIA is the set of choices made between 1942 and 1947 about what kind of institution to build, by what methods to operate it, and under what oversight to place it. Those choices were made by specific men, in specific organizational contexts, responding to specific strategic challenges that they understood in specific ways. William Donovan made the choices that created the OSS. Frank Wisner made the choices that created the covert operations capability. Alan Dulles made the choices that shaped the CIA's first decade of operations. The classified NSC directives made the choices that authorized what those men wanted to do. Congress made the choice to pass the National Security Act without fully understanding what it was authorizing. The public made no choice at all, because the institution's actual capabilities and actual operations were classified. That structure, in which consequential choices about American foreign policy were made by a small number of men operating in a classified environment without meaningful public accountability, is what the true origin of the CIA produced. It produced Iran 1953, Guatemala 1954, Vietnam, Chile 1973, Central America in the 1980s, and a range of operations whose full documentation is still not public. The National Security Act of 1947 is where the conventional account begins. The OSS records of 1942 are where the actual story begins. The gap between those two starting points is where the CIA's true origin lives. It is documented. It has been documented for decades. The documents are available. The conventional account does not use them. That gap is the story. The true origin of the CIA is not 1947. It is 1942, and the men who carried what they built in 1942 through the legislative formality of 1947 and into the operational reality of the 5 decades that followed. Their names are in the documents, their methods are in the documents, their networks are in the documents. The institution they built is still operating. Subscribe if you want to follow more stories where the documents lead. I'll see you in the next one. The question the conventional account never asks about the CIA's origin is the one that the documentary record makes most urgent. If the institution was built by men who are not accountable to Congress, funded by budgets that Congress did not know the details of, authorized by classified directives that Congress had not voted on, and operating through networks that had their origins in a wartime agency that had been dissolved precisely because a president was concerned about its peacetime implications, then what exactly is the relationship between the CIA and the democratic system it claims to serve? The question is not rhetorical. It is the question that the Church Committee asked in 1975 and 1976, and the answer it received, documented in the committee's published reports, was that the relationship had been severely strained by decades of operations conducted outside the knowledge of the public and its elected representatives. The reforms that followed the Church Committee, the intelligence oversight committees, the requirement for presidential findings before covert actions, the notification requirements for significant intelligence activities were designed to repair that relationship. Whether they succeeded is a question that the subsequent history of CIA operations, from Iran-Contra in the 1980s to the torture program of the 2000s to the surveillance programs revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013, makes difficult to answer with confidence. Each of those episodes involved authorized activities conducted with minimal public knowledge, producing consequences that required subsequent congressional and public scrutiny, followed by institutional reforms that were presented as definitive solutions to the oversight problem, which were then followed by the next episode. The cycle reflects the structural tension that was built into the CIA's origin. An intelligence agency operating in a democratic system must balance the operational requirements of secrecy with the democratic requirements of accountability. The men who built the CIA from the OSS prioritized operational secrecy. The democratic accountability requirements were addressed through the minimum oversight structures that the political system required to pass the enabling legislation. That balance has never been resolved, because the tension it reflects is not resolvable through organizational design.